simply the breaking down of organic matter. Compost is any organic matter that is decomposing. So that's anything containing carbon. It could be wood, it could be plant material, it could be kitchen scraps. And industrial composting can also be meats and things like that. We don't put meats in our home compost generally for some reasons I'll talk about here in a minute. Great thing about composting is it just happens on its own, right? Organic matter naturally decays, and really it's microbes naturally break down organic matter. We all know this, right? If you leave a banana on the counter, it doesn't sit there in perpetuity. Eventually it starts rotting quicker than you'd probably like. So decay, the process of composting is always happening going all around us. So there you go, talk over, put stuff in a pile, it'll decompose. No, right? There's more to it than that. So when we do backyard composting, what we're really looking to do is speed the process of decay and then end up with a high quality end product that we can use, or we can put to use, or someone can put to use. So most of us are going to be dealing with like this. I think you guys can see my cursor. This kind of home composting with small pile, but there are commercial operations that do large amounts of composting. It's a lot easier to get a uniform product with that big pile. When we do home composting, one of our challenges is getting a uniform product, partially because our piles are so small generally. We'll talk about ways we can deal with that as we get into the talk here. So why would we want to do composting? Well, I already said, as gardeners or people who have landscapes that we maintain, we might want to have the compost to add back to our garden beds. Compost is as close to a silver bullet in terms of managing your soil as anything is in life. Having organic matter in the soil, which you're adding via the compost, improves the water holding capacity of soil, improves the aeration of the soil. It helps the soil form a structure that is looser than like your clay, right? Helps your soil aggregate and form structure. It's as close to magic as you get with about anything. So we might want to have compost to use it in our yards. And then also there's kind of like the larger environmental picture. Like we keep all the materials that we put in our compost hypothetically from going into the landfill. Landfills are expensive to maintain. They're expensive to build. It's a lot large carbon costs getting stuff to there. So there's a lot of reasons we might want to keep stuff out of landfills, and landfill operators want to keep stuff out of landfills. It doesn't need to be there. There's that larger picture too. In terms of what we can compost, as homeowners, mostly we're probably going to be dealing with kitchen scraps, maybe grass clippings. I would make the case that for most of the time for grass clippings, you should just let them lie on the lawn and naturally decompose. And just break down and return to the soil. But you might be composting your grass clippings if you let the lawn grow too long, or you're just very fastidious about how your lawn looks at all times. Fresh plant materials, so that would be just like stuff you pull out of the garden. That all is fine to compost. Leaves in the fall are fine to compost. Again, if they're on a lawn, you can just mulch them into the lawn without any negative consequences, but if you want to compost your leaves, you can. Straw that you might have been using for some purpose. Small branches of trees and shrubs can be composted. They may compost very slowly, and you want to be careful how much you add to your compost, because it can really, they're very high in carbon, and it can really slow down the composting process. And then finally, you can also compost paper, as long as it doesn't have those shiny inks. Color ink is fine, but some of the shiny inks can contain heavy metals, so you don't want to be putting a lot of that in compost you might be using in a yard or garden. But you can compost newspaper, any non-glossy printed paper. I compost when I'm short on carbon materials in the winter. Sometimes I'll compost my junk mail. So a wide variety of things that we can compost in home compost piles. There are some things though that we shouldn't put in our home compost piles. Some of them for more practical reason, like for like purely, like they would compost, but there are some like practical reasons maybe we wouldn't want to compost them, and others things they just won't break down. So meats, oils, anything in that category we don't want to add to our compost pile. One, because they can, there's like nuisance issues like smells, but two, they can also attract pests to your compost pile, rodents, other animals to your pile, so that you can create a nuisance that way. If you want to compost, if you're just really into composting and you want to be able to compost like cooking scraps that contain meat, you need to think about a special compost system that's going to be buried in the ground so that the animals can't get to it. But generally, so for above ground compost, we generally don't compost oils and meats. We want to be very careful also about putting any weeds in our compost pile which have already gone to seed, because those seeds, especially in a home compost pile, are probably not going to be killed in the pile. Now, commercial compost that gets above about 140 degrees, those weed seeds can be killed. Very few home compost. So you be very careful about putting weed seeds in the pile, or eventually you'll be putting those weed seeds into your garden beds, creating more weeding for you to do. Weeds that don't have seeds, no problem. You pull them early before they flower and have seed, you can put that in your compost pile, absolutely no problem. One thing that we don't want to be doing is putting pet or human waste in our compost pile. I know that maybe seems like a no-brainer, especially the human waste to a lot of people, but there's actually quite a movement out there of people who are trying to use their own waste in their gardens, all very well intentioned in terms of like environmental concerns, but the human health risks are just, you don't probably want to be taking those risks. Again, if your compost pile got hot enough to kill disease organisms, maybe this is just something you could do, but because we share several disease issues with our pets, cats and dogs particularly, we don't want to be putting their waste in our pile for risk of contaminating the compost pile and contaminating our gardens. Similar vein, you don't want to actually put diseased plants in your compost pile, because the disease may persist in the compost pile, and then you add it back to the garden. You end up adding it back to the garden and reinfesting your plants the next year. So if your garden plants are dying or are suffering from a disease issue, tomatoes or your tomatoes have a bacterial wilt or something, you don't want to put those plants in your compost pile. You want those to go out with the trash. You want them to leave the site, so all the inoculum in the plants leaves as well. You can compost it on site, no problem. Another one that might seem like a no-brainer is plastic. Plastic is not one of the great things about plastic, and also one of the worst things about plastic is that it doesn't. It's not broken down by microorganisms. All the plastic that we create is here. Here. It break down into smaller pieces, but it's always going to be plastic. So you don't want to be putting it in your pile, or it's going to be there forever. And if you do this, you'll notice that, right? If you put plant tags in your compost, they'll be there forever. Eventually, they'll break down into little pieces, but they'll still be in your pile or move to your gardens. We don't put plastic into the compost pile. And this actually also applies to most compostable plastics. Those things are compost, like you'll see these containers that say compostable plastic, or glasses that say compostable plastic. Those can be broken down in a commercial composting system, but in your home compost, not go down that is practical for you. So we don't put. If you put you don't want to put even the compostable plastics into your pile. And finally, kind of a tricky thing is that if you've sprayed like your lawn with a herbicide to take care of dandelions or something, or you've sprayed some weeds and then cut them, you want to be very careful about putting anything that's been treated with herbicides into your compost pile, including those weeds and grass clippings, as they can sometimes carry over in the compost pile and then be re-released and harm your plants. So what time frame is practical is always the question. Like, how long after I treat my grass with a weed fertilizer? Sorry, looks like there's an issue with my audio. Hopefully it's gotten better. My internet's been a little finicky recently, so hopefully it's gotten better. Anyways, as I was saying, we want to be really careful about treating about putting anything that's been treated with an herbicide into our compost pile. Sometimes it's safe after a couple of weeks. Sometimes it takes months, depending on the product and conditions of the pile, like how humid it is, how warm it is, how quickly it's decomposing. So I just, as a rule, don't put anything in my pile, my compost piles, which has been treated with an herbicide, just to be safe. There probably are ways to safely do it, but I just don't mess around with it. Okay, so we've talked about what you can put in your pile. Most people probably had some clue about all that stuff. Where I find that people struggle with composting is they feel like they put stuff out in their pile and it just sits there and it doesn't decompose at any any appreciable rate, and they get frustrated. So what I'd like to do is give you a list of kind of things, a checklist of things you can do to make sure you're successful with your compost pile. The first thing, kind of like your base, is to make sure that you're putting the proper mix of materials into your compost pile. We care primarily about the composition of the stuff we put in based around two nutrients, carbon and nitrogen. We want to have the right mix of those two elements in the pile to achieve rapid decomposition. I'm going to talk a lot about that in 1 second. We also would like our pile will decompose a lot quicker if it is moist, but not necessarily like soaking wet, like a wrung out sponge. In Colorado, this may mean you have to water your compost actually pretty often to keep it decomposing, especially if we go through dry periods. We also want to, in the same vein, we want to make sure that we have good aeration in our pile too, meaning we don't want to overwater it and fill up all the pores with water. And we want to make sure that we're turning it or stirring it to add air into the pile. And I'll talk about ways to do that. There's some pretty cool tools out there, like this little corkscrew thing here, which you kind of put into the pile like a wine opener, and then pull out. And then finally, we want to make sure that our pile is large enough to has enough mass to stay warm and decompose. And generally, this means you want to have an optimal size is larger than 3 by 3 by 3. And for a lot of people, that's pretty tough to do if you're just composting your kitchen scraps. On the other hand, if you're a pretty avid gardener, you'll have more than enough material to maintain a pile that size. So let's talk about these in a little more depth. First, let's talk about what the different compositions of chemically the stuff that's going into the pile. We're going to refer to the nitrogen-containing material, or material that's high in nitrogen, I should say, as green material. This would include things like your kitchen scraps, fresh grass clippings, or fresh plant waste right out of the garden, like you see this gentleman here clipping in the picture. So those would be the green things. They're things that are high in nitrogen. Things that are high in carbon, we call the brown material. This would be things like dry leaves, straw, wood chips, which you want to be careful about adding too many wood chips to your pile, newspaper, things like that. And generally, they're more brown in color. So that's it's a literal thing, the green versus brown. In our pile, ideally, we want to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30-1 by weight. Okay, so that's kind of a abstract concept, right? So you could, if you were running a commercial operation, you would know the composition of what was going into your pile by weight. You'd know that I'm putting in this this sawdust, which has a very high C to N ratio, like 100-1. So I need to add a bunch of stuff with a relatively high nitrogen ratio, like either a fertilizer or vegetable scraps or something like that to balance it out. For most of us at home, we're not going to know exactly what the ratio is of what we're putting into the pile. So there are some rules of thumbs for that. So I just have a little note here because I think it's interesting. So if the goal is to put in what goes into the pile is 30-1 carbon to nitrogen. Soil microbes in their body only have a ratio of 8-1. So they're breaking down all of that organic matter, and along the way, carbon is getting lost. They're putting some carbon in their body, some nitrogen in their body, but along the way, some big portion of the carbon is being lost. And So the question is, where does it all go? And that's kind of the, the cool thing about composting. So all that carbon is lost as CO2 back into the atmosphere through respiration. And then, something like a tree will take that in and release oxygen. So it's part of that cycle of these elements, that's part of, ecology and the climate, and all of that. So anyways, it's kind of cool. So after microbes have worked on our pile, the carbon to nitrogen ratio will actually be reduced to about 10-1. That's a high quality compost has that ratio. But anything less than about 21 is fine to use in the garden. If it's higher than 21, it may actually tie up some nitrogen in your garden when you add it. So so generally the rule of thumb is that you want, and I don't know where this went in my slides, I think I lost it. The rule of thumb is that you want to have, by weight, 2 parts green to 1 part brown. That's the general rule of thumb. 1-to-1 green to brown by weight is fine, but generally for home compost, 2-to-1 green to brown is a little bit safer. So, maybe you're getting your green material from kitchen scraps, like here in, this is ours at our house. We collect the kitchen scraps here in this bucket. Maybe your brown is some leaves you saved, or maybe it's paper shredding or whatever you're using for brown. You figure out by weight how much to add, 2 parts green to 1 part brown. And then the very best way to do this, and what I think is a pretty easy way, is to mix those, to get those weight out, and then mix them in a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket, and add them to your pile all mixed. You can also layer them in your pile. If you do layer them though, make sure the layers are thin. Don't put in like a 6-inch thick layer of brown with your green layer over, or something like that. Make sure the layers are thin. That'll speed decay. If the layers are thick, decay is going to be slowed down. So 2-to-1 green to brown, mix them up, and then put them in your pile. Once everything's in the pile, so one little side note before I get into this, actually, there are 2 general methods adding stuff to a compost pile. One is to save up your materials for a little bit and then make a compost pile all at once and quit adding to it. So you'll put the stuff into the pile over the course of maybe a week or 2, and then you add nothing else to the pile. Pretty easy to do at the end of the season. This way it all composts uniformly, and then you start, when you have more material, you start a new pile for that material. This is good if you've got space. It's good if you have a large amount of material, but for a lot of homeowners, it's not super practical. Most of us just have a pile that we're constantly adding stuff to, which is going to make it's a little more challenging to manage, because you have all this very composted material mixing with fresh material, and it slows it down a little bit and makes it hard to use the compost, but it's just kind of the way we go. So it's just kind of the way we have to go. In either case, though, we want to make sure that once we've made our pile, we're keeping it moist. This is a perfect picture of what moist compost should look like. It should feel like a wrung out sponge. Should not be dripping water, but should not be dry to the touch. If your pile is too dry, you can water it, or even consider covering it. In the wintertime, covering your compost pile can be a really good thing. It can retain moisture and help the pile also stay hot. In the summertime, you may not need to cover it. Covering can preserve some moisture, but the temperature issue is not so much a factor in the summers. When I say cover, that would be with a sheet of plastic or a tarp or something like that. On the other hand, if your pile is too wet, you may consider removing your lid to your container if it has one, taking off a tarp if you put one on there, or adding more brown material, which oftentimes will absorb some of the water. You can also try turning the pile more often if it's too wet. That'll usually help it dry out. And of course, if you're watering the pile and it's too wet, water less often. But again, wrung out sponge is what you're shooting for. You got to water your compost pile in Colorado just like you water a plant. It's full of living organisms, and they need to be moist. They need to have water to do their work, breaking down the organic matter. The other thing all those microorganisms need is oxygen. They need oxygen as part of their metabolism to perform aerobic decay. Whole sets of organisms, they're in the soil, and they almost all need oxygen. So the way we make sure there's oxygen in the soil is that we turn it. Or it's not the soil, sorry. The compost pile is that we turn it. You can turn it with a pitchfork. Works pretty well if your compost is pretty finished. Some people like to turn their piles by taking them from one bin, like this gentleman is, and putting them in the next bin over. That adds a bunch of oxygen. So just every couple of weeks, they'd move compost from bin to bin to bin to aerate it. This is like a sort of like a rotor that you put into the pile in turn to aerate it. That works well. Similar mechanism is this corkscrew thing. This is what I use. You can get one online for pretty reasonable. You twist it into the pile, and then once you're at the bottom of the pile, you pull up, and either you fluff the pile if it's very dense and matted, or it pulls a core out and aerates the pile that way. So all those require physical labor. And one thing I've learned about people is we're always trying to avoid physical labor, which has led to some of these fancy compost bins like this one here, which are on a axle. So you can spin the compost bin to aerate it. It's a pretty good idea. In my experience, these kind of spinning bins have some problems. One, in the winter, they tend to freeze more easily because they're off the ground and wrapped all around in cold air without the ground insulating and radiating heat up to them on the bottom. They tend to dry out pretty fast too, again, because they're above ground, so they drain a little better. So you have to really watch their water content. And then also, you have to be careful where you put them. It's just burned in my memory that my mother had one of these, and it was on a concrete slab, and it dripped like, I guess you'd call it compost tea. It dripped just wet, a brown fluid out of it the whole time, and it stained her compost. So hers was cheap. Maybe there's better ones that don't leak, but anyways, easy to turn, but there's some other challenges using them. I'm not saying you can't use them, but there's some other challenges to using those sorts of systems. So again, oxygen is necessary for aerobic decay. Aerobic decay is a hot process. It's what actually heats up the pile. Heat is released during it. In fact, enough heat that in a well-managed compost pile with enough size, it can actually heat the pile to 140 degrees or sometimes more. And it's a quick process too, I should say. Anaerobic decay is something that is a process that does go on. There are microbes that can do decay without oxygen being present, but it is a stinky process. It is slower, and it does not heat the pile, so it will not kill weeds or pathogens. So that's why I want to aerate, to make sure that we got the setup that we're activating, so to speak, the set of microbes that do aerobic decay, not activating the anaerobic microbes. So turn your pile. I swear, if you've never turned your compost pile, you start turning it every week or every other week, you're gonna see that pile start decaying at a rate that you will be shocked by. So make sure you're aerating. Make sure your pile has the correct moisture. Make sure you're putting the right stuff into your pile. All of that influences the rate of decay. If your pile's going slow, look at those factors and see which one maybe you can work on. What I'm going to talk about now is some different systems you can use to compost, but all those same factors apply, no matter how fancy a compost bin you buy or how low tech of compost pile you have. All those things I talked about before apply to these systems. There's no like free ticket on it, or free meal on it. I have here just pictures of some of the common compost systems. There's obviously a lot more than this out there. This is a very simple one, just of lashed together pallets, will work just fine. Big pile, pretty easy to turn because you get in the front, pretty easy to get the compost out so you can use it. Well aerated, probably will dry out a little quicker than a plastic container because you're going to lose moisture on the sides. But generally, a good system. Maybe looks a little haphazard for some people, depending on how neat you like your yard. This is just a variation of that. This is my compost system. I just have T-posts, and there is metal mesh fencing here between them. I've got 3 compost piles. I usually add compost to one all season, and then I call that pile done and let it compost and finish and use one of the other bins. So I've got all 3 in various stages of decay. Again, I like it because I've got a lot of compost where I'm at, and they're pretty easy to turn. Also, they touch the earth, so they are a little better insulated. So that's a classic kind of 3 compost bin system there. You can also buy pre-made compost containers. This one's plastic, pretty slick, right? Has got slits for aeration. Dredge has this little door. I would think this is a little bit harder to turn once it's full, right? Getting it down to the bottom to turn it's going to be a struggle. So maybe you don't want to ever let it fill up too much, or it's kind of difficult to get the compost out the bottom. But otherwise, nothing wrong with that system. It's covered, so it should retain moisture a little better. And again, I already talked about these rolling ones. Nothing particularly wrong with them. I just personally don't know that it's quite as easy, or it's not quite the silver bullet they're advertised to be. A lot easier to turn. So if you can't physically turn your pile for whatever reason, it might be the type to think about. So yeah, you can go from all the way from the high tech to low tech options. You know, there's a whole wide variety out there, and I'm have a few more minutes here for the talk. So we'll talk just a little bit more about troubleshooting the pile. So if your pile is not acting right, if it's smelly, or if it's not composting, again, it probably has to do with air in the pile, water in the pile, or what you're putting into it. So if your compost has a bad smell to it, it could be from a couple things. It could be because the pile's too wet and you're getting anaerobic decay, which would be kind of like that stinky, putridy smell. And in that case, you need to aerate it, quit watering the pile, maybe add some brown material. If it smells sharp and ammonia-y, that could mean that you're adding too much green material to it. So you've been putting too much veggie scraps, too much fresh grass clippings, etc. And in that case, you need to add some brown material to it and turn it to get your pile composition back to being correct. So a good compost pile should have almost no smell, and like mine generally doesn't smell, but every year we have a bunch of big old apple trees, and we inevitably don't pick all the fruit, and it ends up on the ground. And so every year at some point I put like a bushel of decomposing apples into my compost, and I pretty much just accept that it's going to smell after that, right? Because I've added so much green material. I'll put brown material over it, but yeah, if it's smelling, it's probably something like that. And I see people raising their hands, so you can get, if the chat's not open yet, you can get the chat open and you can start queuing up questions for me, and I'll answer them here in just a second. Yeah, so you guys should be able to chat now. I just turned it on. And I see someone raising their hand, so if it's a question, just throw it in chat, and when I'm done with this slide, I think this is my last slide, I'll happily answer whatever questions I can. So some of the other things that go wrong with your pile, if it's too dry, you need to be watering it a little more regularly. If it's dry in the center, it's a definite sign you need to be watering it more regularly. If it's like wet on the edge and dry in the center, get a hose on it, get a sprinkler on it, get a little more moist. If the pile is dry on the outside, that might be something you can just solve by covering it. You water and then cover, and it'll keep our dry air from pulling the moisture out of that outer edge of the pile. If the center of your pile is damp and warm but not hot, that could mean your pile maybe is too small. You need more mass. So in that case, for most of us, that just means either you got to beg your neighbors for their vegetable scraps, or you just accept your pile is not working optimally because you don't produce enough material for it. If the center of your pile is hot, steaming hot, but the outside is cool and dry, it may mean that there's a lack of nitrogen. If you're smelling that sweet, if you're smelling something that's like sweet smelling, in the mass is not, sorry, if you're smelling something sweet and the pile is not heating up, that probably means you need to add some nitrogen to it. So if you have a bunch of grass clippings, you can throw those in there. Otherwise, even a nitrogen fertilizer in small amounts will make up for that lack of nitrogen, or some fresh manure, which could also be high in nitrogen. So if you want to screenshot this, that's fine. This is also part of a fact sheet that we have that I'll be sending out after the talk as a handout. So that's kind of a very basic overview of home composting. If you put it in a pile, it'll decompose. It's just a matter of how fast it's going to decompose. You can make stuff decompose faster by following a lot of the rules I talked about, or if you're kind of lazy or don't make much waste, you can just throw it in a pile and it'll decompose slowly on its own. So with that, I will open up the chat here. Look at this good number of questions. I'm going to go to the top and kind of start with the top of the All right, so I'm seeing a lot of questions with the audio. I hope that got up for everybody. Okay, so you say kitchen scraps are accessible. However, are there scraps that should not be used? Most kitchen scraps are totally fine except for meats and oils. Eggshells are fine. They don't really decompose in the compost. They just get broken down into smaller bits. So you add some calcium back to your soil that way. However, in Colorado, a lot of our soils have plenty of calcium anyways. So I don't know if you really need to be doing that, but pretty much everything, everything but meat or oils are fine to put in your compost pile. So can cardboard be composted? Yep, cardboard can definitely be composted. I would tear it up into little bits. Something I didn't get into in this talk, just because it's a shorter talk, is that your compost will actually decompose quicker if you have finer material. So it's because it's more surface area. So if you tear up that cardboard, shred your plant material, anything like that, it'll speed it up. But yeah, generally cardboard can be composted as long as it doesn't have a glossy finish. If it's like a fancy box with a glossy finish, that I would just put in recycle. Is the toner used for printed paper or newspaper toxic for the pile? Generally speaking, the ink is glossy, you're fine. So newspaper, plain old matte newspaper is fine. The glossy, like advertising section, that one should just go in your recycle bin. Most ink is soy-based and totally fine to compost. Question about pine needles. They be used to compost. Sure, pine needles compost, but I would be very cautious about adding them to your pile because they're very waxy and they're going to be very slow to decompose. So if you do add them, make sure to like grind them up first, run them through some sort of shredder, or just accept that they're going to decompose very slowly because again, they're so waxy. If you're trying to have a fast, efficient compost pile, I would not be putting a bunch of pine needles in it. Hopefully that makes sense. Which type of bin is best for keeping bears out? I'm not the biggest expert on that topic. I know it's a big issue in some of the foothill and mountain communities. Honestly, my guess is that if you're going to have compost at where there's wildlife like bears around, you're probably just going to have to deal with it. You're probably going to want to get a metal bin with some sort of locking lid, which is fine from the composting perspective. But you're going to want to get a sturdy container with a locking lid. If you still have questions about that, email me and I can look for some resources for you from the extension agents that are in areas where they regularly deal with that. I do know, so I'm going to mispronounce that type of composting. I have read about it. Bokashi, I think, composting. I think it's fine. I think it's just it's like a lot of things though. I'm not really sure. For most of us, for homeowners, I think it's probably more than we need. If you want to have a conversation about it longer afterwards, shoot me an email and we can either hook up over the phone or chat about it via email. It's kind of a long topic to talk about. I think it's fine. I personally just let the microbes do their work in my pile because it's easier for me. What about a lot of coffee grinds? Okay, first part of that question, let's define a lot. So we can have too much organic matter in our soil. We want to have about 5%. If we get more than that, we actually have maybe more than we need. We may be losing nitrogen to leaching, may hold too much water. So there can be too much of anything. So when you say a lot, it also depends on the area you're spreading them over. Like if you're putting, a half inch of coffee grounds a week in your garden, that's probably too much. If you're putting an eighth of an inch a month, that's probably pushing it. If you're putting in a dusting of them a month, that's probably fine. Into your sorry, I'm thinking about the garden because that's always the question I was going to ask. So be very careful at adding too much directly to your garden. In terms of your compost pile, coffee grounds are acidic and they have a relatively kind of neutral carbon to nitrogen ratio. I don't know off the top of my head, I believe it's south of 20 on its own. So you can add them to your pile and you can even add quite a few of them to your pile and it should be fine. But you're still going to need to add some green material to balance them out. They also hold a lot of water. So if you're adding just ground, soggy. So you're going to want to make sure you're mixing other stuff in there to prevent the sogginess from happening. But there's nothing wrong with even using quite a bit of compost, coffee grounds in your compost pile. What are good cover materials? I'm going to assume you mean covering the compost pile. For me, for the compost pile, if I'm going to cover it, I have an old tarp, an old kind of, tarp that I think was once used to cover like a car when I was in college in someone's driveway. And I just use that to cover my pile. Any sort of plastic will work just fine. You could layer on, if it's a pile that you're not turning, you could layer on some wood chips to help preserve moisture. Just know that in effect, when you're putting wood chips up there, what you're doing is adding a carbon source to the pile. So you want to plan accordingly for that, right? You don't want to be adding a bunch of wood chips and find your piles really slows down in its rate of decomposition. When you turn it, hypothetically, those wood chips get mixed in. So generally, I just like an old tarp, but you could use wood chips if you wanted to. Just be careful about using too many and turning them in. Catherine says, having trouble finding brown things to compost. Any suggestions? No leaf available. So, I think one source that almost all of us have for brown stuff is our junk mail. Just don't use any of the envelopes with the plastic windows and anything with glossy ink, but you can run your junk mail through a shredder and put that in your compost pile, no problem. You can also, composting gets to be kind of an obsession for some people, and they end up just, becoming compost scavengers. So you can talk to your neighbors, you can talk to friends, have them bring you brown material. You could also go buy or try to get free wood chips from an arborist and use those as your brown source. Can you add dog fur and people hair? Well, probably technically yes, but it's going to decompose very, very slowly. Hair is mostly protein, and it's not going to, and wax. So I personally would not add dog fur or people hair to my pile because I think it's just going to sit there mostly and not decompose. But I don't think there's a reason from a health perspective not to add it, if that makes sense. It just will take a very long time to decompose. Let's see. Can you use compost that has not been decomposed when starting a new veggie bed? Okay, so the issue with using compost that's not finished is that it may, when you add it to your garden bed, tie up nitrogen for a time. So just as the microbes are decomposing, they suck the nitrogen in, they tie up nitrogen in their bodies. And then after the decomposition is done, a percentage of the microbes die off and then nitrogen is released. So adding non-decomposed compost to your garden bed just risks tying up some nitrogen for a while. It'll decompose in the soil on its own, just not quite as uniformly or as quick as it will in the pile. I have a couple questions about would it be beneficial to add worms to the compost pile. So there is like very specific sort of composting where, we use worms, permaculture. And you can look that up online if you do a search for it and put extension in the search terms. You can find fact sheets how to do it. But otherwise, I think that that if you have organic matter in the pile and it's suitable habitat for worms, they're probably going to move into it anyways. They're not going to like the compost pile until it's pretty finished. Won't hurt to add them, but I think the pile should be fine on it. Mostly the pile will be fine on its own. Question about keeping raccoons out. So I'll just address that more broadly. Essentially all you can do is get a more secure bin or bury the scraps. So the things they like, you layer it and you put the food scraps and then you layer whatever your brown material is on top of that. Like you always are trying to bury the food scraps. I don't have a silver bullet for raccoons though, besides a more secure container and burying it. You might be able to apply some of the repellent products that are out there to your pile, like the cayenne pepper sort of based ones. I would not use the urine based ones in your pile, but you might be able to put some of those repellents out there to keep them away too. Those work for a while, but they end up decomposing. They end up getting washed away when there's rain or something like that. Do you use a thermometer or moisture reader on your pile? I have in the past. Right now, I don't take my composting quite that seriously, But you can buy a lung thermometer. In fact, if you just look for compost thermometer, they'll show up in the top of your Google list. And it's kind of cool, let you know how you're doing, right? Like if you see your pile decrease in temperature, you may know you need some more nitrogen, et cetera. So you can definitely do it. I don't do it all the time. I used to keep better track of that, but you can definitely get one and use it. I have never used a moisture meter in my compost pile. For a compost pile, I just pretty much go by touch. And actually, you can do it pretty much visually too once you get good at it. Just like looking at it, you can tell if it's moist enough or too wet or too dry. Will veggie seeds like tomatoes or peppers grow in your pile? Yeah, occasionally you'll get a plant in your pile. For me, it's always cucumbers and squashes that you are not. Melons and squashes that germinate in my pile. But yeah, you'll occasionally get a seed germinating. I transplant that out into your garden or just kill it and turn it into the pile. Video where they said not to use onion, garlic, or citrus in your compost pile. Do you agree? I don't. You can overdo anything. If all you're putting into your pile is citrus, it could create problems. If all you're putting in is garlic, I put those things in compost piles my entire life and never had an issue with them. The internet's full of things that have like maybe a little truth behind them, but people take it a little bit too far. So I don't stress about that. Judith asks, advantage to above ground bins. Oh, yeah, it's more of a comment. Thank you. Whenever I start a new pile, it attracts insects. Is there a way to solve this? So if your pile is attracting a lot of flies, you might just try mixing in some more brown material. That probably means a little high in nitrogen. Some flies are just going to be a feature of a compost pile, to be honest. It's just kind of a fact of life with the compost pile. I don't know of a super good way to keep flies out of compost. Sorry, but I actually do have one tip. Again, just like the raccoons, if you're burying the green material and putting the brown material on top and making layers, that will generally keep the fly population down a little bit. It won't eliminate it, but it'll keep it down. Someone says that we have 100% in-ground compost with hundreds of worms. Is this good? Yep, that sounds like it's working like it should. Stuff's in there and just things working their way through it, decomposing it. Jennifer asks, how long does your compost need to sit before you use in your garden? Well, you want to have it compost to the point that you don't recognize you can't recognize it for what it was, right? Like you can't see orange peels or at least not many, stuff that still looks like plant material, like leaves or whatever. You want to have it pretty thoroughly broken down. Depending how you're composting how you're running your compost, that could be anywhere from, months to years. So I do a B+ job with my compost. And so essentially I close the pile for new material. And then the next growing season, which is usually something like 6 months away, I use it in the garden. The caveat to all that is that if you're composting manure, you should not use fresh manure or compost made from fresh manure. You should not use fresh manure in the garden any closer than 4 months before harvest because of worries about E. coli and listeria and things like that. So if it's got manure base, you need to let it sit for a couple months, 4 months. Can you build a compost bin with treated lumber? Really good question about that. Modern treated lumber, the answer is yeah, it probably won't be a big deal. I wouldn't use like creosote blade and railroad ties and old treated wood, which contained arsenic derived products. I probably wouldn't use that either. But the modern stuff is treated with these copper compounds, and I don't think it's gonna. They can leach out, and copper can be toxic, but it's probably not going to be an issue for a variety of reasons. So you're probably fine to use modern treated lumber. Let's see. We do not seem to have many worms in my area, as it's mostly gravel rocky. As we continue to build our soil, it would be beneficial to add buckets of worms. So my experience with worms is generally as you improve the soil, they will show up on their own. They're pretty good colonizers. It's not going to hurt to add them, but my guess is they'll show up on their own. Um, can you add chicken manure? So adding chicken manure to a compost pile. Sure, you can compost chicken manure. Anytime you're dealing with manure, though, you want to be much more careful about your composting, right? Because of the risks of E. coli and things like that. So I would not be putting chicken manure. Um, yeah, I don't put it in the pile that goes into my vegetable garden. Or if I do use it in my vegetable garden, I compost, I aerate it, I turn it for it's usually about a half year. I probably don't have to do it that long, but I just like the peace of mind. I don't want anyone in my family getting E. coli from eating a carrot, right? That turns like the fun garden into like a depressing trip to the hospital. So um, you can definitely compost the chicken manure. It's going to be high in nitrogen, so you're going to need to add a lot of carbon to it, and it's also a lot higher in manures are a lot higher in salts too. If you want to know more about composting chicken manure, shoot me an email and I can tell you about it. What about a freestanding pile with no walls? I haven't gotten it quite 3 feet tall, but it seems to be working. Yep, that's totally fine. People like make a loop out of like metal or hardware cloth or metal fencing, or even like wire fencing. Totally works fine. Nothing you should be worried about. Pile will dry a little quicker because it has all that mesh, because it has a mesh siding, or maybe no siding if you're just making a pile, but nothing to worry about with that. How to best use compost. Example of Marion. I don't know what that project is refers to there, but for your home compost, we would recommend adding 2 to 3 inches of it to each step to your garden each year and
I
turning
did
it
look
in.
it up. It's a carbon sequestration project, so
Oh, okay.
and it's
Yeah, so
large scale in ranch lands.
gotcha. So if you have a lot of compost, yeah, I mean, they do things like, I've seen, you know, so compost is sequestering carbon. You put it in the soil. Some of that carbon goes back to the atmosphere, but a lot of it is banked in the soil, especially if you are adding it every year. So if you want to, think about using it for, some wider purpose, that's fine. Just by putting it into your garden, you're getting a lot of those effects though. So should I be concerned about flies? I think I already talked about flies. I don't let them bother me, but if they're bugging you, you might want to think about a compost bin with a lid. Maybe think about putting your green materials under your brown materials. Probably just accepting them as probably part of life. As the pile finishes, you'll get less and less flies. They're really common on the fresh material and less on as the pile composts more completely. Yeah, so yeah, there are lots of insects that'll be in your compost pile decomposing stuff. Don't worry about them one bit. That's totally fine. Nothing to stress about. They're doing their job. Don't worry about anything about grubs in the pile. Do I have a list of? Yeah, I will be sending out a fact sheet afterwards that has a lot of the material that was in the talk in terms of what's brown, and what's green, and even one that has a bit of a reference for carbon and nitrogen ratio. So yeah, I will send that out after the talk, Karen. My husband is a home brewer. Can we compost his leftover mash? Yep, I used to do that. It is going to smell because it's a lot of you're adding a lot of sugar, a lot of nitrogen. It's going to smell. You'll need to put a lot of brown material in there with it and accept that it's going to smell for a week, but you can definitely compost the spent barley for sure. So can you use worms in paper? Vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is a very specific type of composting. If you want questions about it, if you have any questions about it, shoot me an email. Extension has a good fact sheet on it I can send you. I think I already talked about this question about pet waste, but just to refrain. So things that are more closely related to us and which we share diseases with, we're very concerned about. But you can properly compost. You can properly compost animal waste. I just don't recommend putting animal waste in your home compost pile, right? Because generally it doesn't get hot enough to kill those pathogens. So that's the issue there, right? So if you have a large pile of horse, cow, goat, whatever manure that you've been composting, as long as you follow the rules around E. coli in terms of 4 months before using it 4 months before harvest or more, you can definitely do that. I just don't like to put it in the home compost pile because it doesn't seem to get hot enough. And there's just too many disease risks there. Question is there a way to test these carbon nitrogen ratio? No, not for you as a homeowner. There's ways to do that in lab. You can find big lists online really easily. Just search carbon to nitrogen ratio on Google, and you can find very thorough lists of what things generally have, which is close enough to get you in the ballpark. Most of us are not, commercial operations are balancing everything perfectly, but for most of us, just getting in the ballpark is good enough. Already talked about onions and citrus, just go for it. My email address. Sorry, I'm just reading questions here. I started placing table scraps in a 5-gallon bucket with dirt and worms inside. At the end of the week, I would take the whole bucket and dump it in the compost. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. I don't put a lot of soil in my compost pile, but some people do add soil to their compost pile. The thought being that they're adding in the microorganisms and maybe earthworms and things like that. But that's totally fine if you want to do it. Just means that the compost is heavier when you go to use it, but that's totally fine. And then the second part of the question is, how do you add compost in the wintertime when there's a foot of snow on top of the pile? What do you do? Yeah, so in that case, either I just throw the compost on top of the snow, the scraps on top of the snow, and when it melts, they're added to the pile, or they kind of pile up next to the pile and then get added to the pile later. That's how I handle that one. Um, so a question about putting a bunch of wood chips in a brown bin. Yeah, I mean, wood chips, you can definitely use them as brown material. If they're very coarse, if they're big wood chips, they're going to decompose very slowly. So if you want to do that, I would try as fine of a chip as you can. Wood oftentimes very slowly. You're going to add a lot of nut to them to get them to decompose, but you can definitely you can decompose it. It's just going to take longer. Do you use paper or just tear it into small pieces? Shred it, it'll make tearing it fine too. Shredding it. You can definitely use shredded as long as it's not glossy. Question about using herbicides. Yeah, so if you wait till next year, you should be fine, unless you're using some very specific chemicals. You should be fine. If it was just 2,4-D or something like that, you should be fine actually within a month or so to be safe. But yeah, or even quicker if you have a good pile. But yeah, but waiting a year would definitely be fine. Yeah, so if you're getting squash seedlings coming up from your compost wasn't hot enough to kill the seedlings, which is really common for home compost bins. Very, very common not to get too hot. So in terms of the green to brown ratio, yeah, so you just use a kitchen scale, and I mean, I pretty much guesstimated at this point. Like I know that my kitchen scraps weigh what they weigh, and then I've got a corresponding bucket I use to scoop up that much of my brown. But yeah, I mean, get it close enough for home composting is fine. If you want to get it to be a big compost geek, then yeah, get out a scale and go for it. Gardener snakes. If there's gardener snakes in your compost pile, they're probably just munching on insects. And I wouldn't worry too much about them. I'm not a big expert on snake deterrent, so I don't have a great answer to that question. But I would just I don't like snakes. They gave me the heebie-jeebies, but I would just try to live with them. They're not doing any harm for sure. So another question about herbicides. So adding a pre-emergent, I'd have to know what pre-emergent they're using. Some of those pre-emergents are pretty long-lived. Some are taken up by plants. Some just stay in the soil. But if you shot me an email with the name of the chemical, I could give you better guidance on that. Finished compost should definitely be worked into the soil, Tom. Yeah, I would turn it in about 8 inches deep, either with a broad fork or a shovel. You could also use a rototiller, of course, but a broad fork and shovel are a little bit nicer, a little bit softer on the soil. See, that's awesome. We're on late, so don't worry about that. Can we add sourdough described to Ben? Yeah, I don't know why not. And you can definitely add bread to the Ben. The only issue about adding breads to the Ben is that if you have pets, be careful, because sometimes those molding bread, the molds that decompose breads, can create toxins that harm dogs and cats. So I would not, if I had pets, be putting bread in my pile, but otherwise you're fine to put bread in your pile. Oh, sorry if I missed your question, Jan. There's a lot of questions.
You
To
got it, and
Ben.
I answered it.
Oh, okay. Did I get it? Yeah, as long as you're getting a good mix of browns and greens, that's the important thing there, Jan. Sorry I missed you the first time. If you needed more information, shoot me an email and we can talk about your system a little more if you want. Do I chop up large kits and scraps more finely? I do. You don't have to, but when they're chopped up, they decompose quicker. I'm the chopper in my household, so I always just, when I'm cutting the vegetables, cut up the scraps into a little bit smaller pieces. You don't have to, but it just speeds up the process. A lot of thank yous. Michael asks, how do you manage adding and harvesting the compost? So if you're using one pile, it's kind of difficult, but you can kind of sift, right? So I add the compost to mine, whenever my kitchen bin is full, I add it. So that could be daily or every other day, depending on how much we're eating at home. And I add it just when it's full. In my situation, I've got the 3 piles, so I'm always harvesting the compost from an old pile and adding to the newest pile, if that makes sense. If you only have one pile, what you're going to want to do is, when you take the compost out, kind of try to sift out the biggest material, and just try to get only the finished stuff out. It can be kind of difficult. Maybe that means you pull from the bottom of the pile. Either your pile has a side you can shovel from the bottom, or it has a door in the bottom, or some way you get the compost in the bottom of the pile. It's difficult though if you only have one pile. It's one of the problems with the single pile system. Dryer lint. I would not put dryer lint in the compost, Debbie, because it's probably got a lot of plastic in it, right? A lot of our clothes are plastic. Oh, Cassie already answered that one, but yeah, I wouldn't put it in your compost pile. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, finished compost should be worked into the soil. That's right, 6 to 8 inches deep. So after you've done making your stock, I don't know about adding those vegetables scraps to the pile. They're probably pretty oily, is my guess. My guess is you're going to have a risk of attracting more rodents and pests to your pile. You can always try it once and see what happens. If it seems like it's working, that's fine. But I don't think I would if it was me. I don't. I'll just tell you that. Yeah. Are you aware of any programs for schools to compost or recycle that I could contact? So Sonia, I know that Cassie can chime in. What is the name of the school there, the STEM school, and that we've gone to help them with that, Cassie?
Do you mean Stargate?
Stargate. So I know Stargate Academy. They're in Thornton, right off of I-25 and 144th, has a composting program. Extension. I'd also be happy to talk to you. We'd help them set that up. I'd also be happy to talk to you about the realities of that, and you can do it, but you just need to be very aware of what the realities of running that program are. Shoot me an email and we can have a chat for sure. But
There are
Stargate's
also
good.
some independent companies that do composting and drop off and pick up in the Denver metro area, if you do
Yeah,
some Google searches.
feels like there's more and more all the time of those kind of professional operations. Thanks so much. Thank you guys for being so polite. Glad I'm feeling better. Yeah, me too. Okay, I think I got through all of the questions. So Thank you all so much. If you come with other questions, shoot me an email. This was a very introductory talk. All these lunchtime talks are supposed to be pretty basic. So if you got more complex questions, feel free to email me. I'm out the rest of the week, so don't be surprised if you don't hear from me till Monday. But I appreciate y'all coming. Enjoy the rest of the week and have a good weekend.